Thanks for joining us, everyone. So I'll do my final introduction and we'll get going today. So thank you for joining us for today's Third Thursday program with the Vermont Historical Society. We're very excited today to have Professor Susan Schulten speaking to us on the graphic reach of Emma Willard. Emma Willard is a favorite of mine, so I was very excited to find some exciting and fascinating new scholarship on Willard herself and on her use of maps and graphics as teaching tools. So Susan Schulten is a professor and the chair of the history department at the University of Denver, where she's taught since 1996. She's the author of a number of wonderful publications, including A History of America in 100 Maps, Mapping the Nation, History and Cartography in 19th-Century America, and the Geographical Imagination in America, 1880 to 1950. We are very excited to have her here today to speak about Emma Willard, and with that, I'm gonna turn the screen over to her.
Thank you, Amanda, and please interrupt me if there's any trouble with my my sound or my pictures. So I'll expect someone to just shout out if there's anything wrong. I'm delighted to be here. I was so thrilled to get this invitation. As Amanda herself has said, I am a huge fan of Emma Willard. I've been a long-standing student of her work and her reach and her influence. And so there's a particularly important connection to Vermont that I'd like to explore today. I'm just going to speak for a minute or two before I hand it over to my PowerPoint, which will let you see some glorious visuals up close in the way that they really should be seen. Just to set the stage, for those of you who don't know, Emma Willard was one of the most influential educators of the 19th century, a best-selling textbook author whose work spanned geography as well as history and a few other subjects, but also, as many of you know, the founder of the Troy Female Seminary near Albany, which continues to operate today, and in the 19th century trained thousands of women to go on to be teachers in every corner of the young United States. So her reach is multifaceted. What I'd like to focus on today is her early life and the impact that her time in Vermont had in shaping what I'm calling her graphic mind, her penchant for visuals, her feeling that the way to help students remember and communicate was first and foremost to imprint on their mind. And to imprint on their mind, she said, the eye is the most impressionable medium. You cannot beat a picture. And indeed, for Willard, she would never settle for text when a picture would do it better. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to my PowerPoint. The first thing I'd like to say on this initial slide is just that I welcome your feedback. I know that we'll have some time for Q&A, but at the same time, if something comes to mind, if there's something you've seen in an archive or in your attic, or some insight you can give to me about these early days of Vermont, I hope that you'll reach out to me, and my email is there on the bottom. And so I'm going to begin with a mystery and a puzzle that occurred to me about 10 years ago. 10 years ago, I was working in a private archive in California and came across an item that absolutely floored me and ended up taking my research in a new direction. I was finishing a book called Mapping the Nation, which looks at the way mapping was transformed over the course of the 19th century. And one of the first chapters was on the place of geography in American schools and the interest that early Americans had in the subject of geography, and Willard figured very prominently. And so you can imagine my excitement when I opened up this item and saw the following. Eliza Henshaw's Book of Penmanship, executed at the Middlebury Female Academy, April 29th, 1823. I was delighted, and I immediately made a rather sloppy error and thought, oh my gosh, given the time and given the place, this penmanship journal must have had a direct connection to Emma Willard. Emma Willard was teaching in Middlebury up until about 1819, and she had a school called the Middlebury Female Seminary, not the Middlebury Female Academy. But I was too excited, and I started to delve into this item. And what it was astounded me. Eliza Henshaw had page after page of artfully crafted language, all of which was taken from textbooks, but which organized information around geography in so many different visual ways. You can see her narrative on the comets at right. You can see the way she's practicing her round and her running hand. And then the more I got into it, I realized that the text was followed by not just exquisitely executed maps as we understand the word. At left, you see Vermont, but look at right. Her counterpoint to each terrestrial map is a word map. So we see Maine here that is described in words and then organized as a word map bounded north by Canada, south by the Atlantic, west by New Hampshire. The entire journal was filled with this kind of artfully arranged information. And in fact, once I had found this, I began to find others. Harriet Baker's book of penmanship at the right here, and maps at Mr. Dunham's school in Windsor, Vermont. Josiah Dunham ran a very well-regarded school for young girls throughout the 18-teens and 20s, early 1820s. And this journal was executed in Windsor, Vermont, just a few miles east of Middlebury, just a few years earlier. Now, what is so remarkable here is that there's no textbook from which these girls are working. There's no template that is published. And so, in other words, what we're finding here, and I have others to show you, is that over and over again, we see examples that could have only been provided by a teacher. And my discovery of these journals took me down a pathway to exploring more and more what constituted the education and the lived experience in the classroom for young girls in the early 19th century. Along with Frances Henshaw and Harriet Baker, we have Catherine Cook's book of penmanship, also at Mr. Dunham's school in the same time period. This one is at the Osher Map Library in Portland, Maine. And as you go into these, you see an incredible sort of sameness. Crucial here is the degree to which young women were practicing their penmanship. And the textbook from which they developed their penmanship practices was Eliza Huntington's An Introduction to the Art of Penmanship. Part of what's remarkable about Huntington's text is that it is published at the same time as these journals. Eliza Huntington was one of many publishers and education reformers living in and around Hartford in the Connecticut River Valley, which was the epicenter for female education and educational reform in the early 19th century. And in fact, it's remarkable to me to see that the intense practices that spanned the explosion of female education in the early 19th century ended up influencing the production of textbooks such as Huntington's. In other words, there's a very complicated relationship between what is being practiced in the classroom and what is eventually being published as the longstanding textbooks that become influential in their own right. So if we look at these penmanship journals, I want to show you a few pages from them because they will help us understand the world of early 19th century female education. And a spoiler alert, this is the world that Emma Willard rebels against. She is a product of it, but it is also the thing that she hopes to reject when reconceptualizing the meat and potatoes of female education. So these are just some pages from Frances Henshaw and Harriet Baker's books. Like I said, there's a kind of sameness to them, even though they're very artistically executed. You can see the way the students are taught to develop word maps like this to help learn their geography, their astronomy, their history. And again, you can see direct evidence that they are picking up cues and learning their penmanship from some of those established penmanship journals. The heart of these penmanship journals was really the maps, and that's what I want to focus on today. Here we're looking at one of the final pages of Harriet Baker's book of penmanship and maps. And I chose it because it really does exemplify The style of map making that figured in so prominently to a young girl's education in the early 19th century. I'll step back in a minute and look at the curriculum as a whole. But what I want to leave you with here is that Harriet Baker's map here, which is so exquisite and precise, was quite typical. It was designed for her to practice her skills of penmanship, of art, of discipline, of replication, of patience, and then maybe last, of geography. And I want to show my hand here, if you will. In other words, part of what's going on in the very, very highly stylized form of teaching map drawing in the early 19th century is a lesson that young women will copy maps or trace them or replicate them more than they will learn the actual principles of map drawing. And I want you to remember that because that's something that really bothered Willard. If we step back and think about education more generally, remember that the proliferation of education for young women outside the home only happened after the Revolution. And there are lots of important reasons for that, not least of which is with the creation of a new nation, there was an importance of educating young women to be mothers to future citizens. So what you see, particularly in the Connecticut River Valley and the Northeast more generally, is an explosion of female seminaries and academies, some tiny and held in living rooms, some very well established, all through the decades of the 1780s, 90s, and the early 19th century. And this is crucial because Emma Willard was part of that first generation to be educated outside of the home. She was born in 1787, and by the age of 5 or 6, she's beginning to attend what is known as the local school or the district school, showing great promise by the time she's 10. And she is taking classes variously in and around Hartford in many of the most well-established female academies. In that sense, she's highly typical. And I give you this quote from John Pinkerton, an important geographer in London in the early 19th century, where he says, "Geography is a study so universally instructive and pleasing that you can even teach it to girls." That's how easy it is to access. And there's, of course, a backhanded insult here, right? John Pinkerton is essentially capturing what was well-established conventional wisdom, and that is that the female curriculum will look very different from the male curriculum. And that in terms of things like science or mathematics, we need to be careful about what we teach girls. And geography fit the bill perfectly. It was a little bit scientific, but not threatening. It gave young women access to the world in a very kind of polite way where they could know something, but not too much, about the world beyond their homes. Geography was quite appropriate. And within geography, what really takes off in the early 19th century in these girls' schools are the long, long, arduous, demanding projects of map drawing. And this is a practice imported from England, which is part of the reason I show you John Pinkerton, as well as this young woman's page from her journal, her geography journal, that came out of London as well in the early 19th century. I'll show you some examples of this. The epicenter of this, like I said, was Hartford. And within Hartford, the gold standard of these schools was Sarah Pierce's Litchfield Female Academy. And I show you here just the decorative graduation announcement that young women were given after finishing the course of study at Miss Sarah Pierce's Academy. And I'll zoom in and read it for you because I know it's a little bit hard to understand, but this gives you a sense of what formed the heart of their education. Miss Seymour has completed with honor the prescribed course of study, grammar, geography, history, arithmetic, etc. Also, of course, at the end, principles of taste, those all-important elements that were also referred to as one's ornamental education. This was really what dominated, even at the best of these schools, schools like Sarah Pierce's Litchfield Female Academy. And at schools like this, the premium was really on performance and judgment. And so what you see here is an end of semester announcement at Miss Pierce's Female Academy, where the young women were given prizes. And I'll draw your attention here. In a general view, Miss Julia Chittenden is considered the most deserving, to whom the prize of merit is impartially adjudged. And then you can see what they're being judged on, their maps, their paintings. I know many of you in the Northeast are very well aware and exposed to the samplers, the needlework, the watercolors that came out of this era. They are highly prized on the market and in museums, and they've really helped me to kind of capture and understand what the look and feel of this female classroom experience really was. And map execution was at the heart of that. At the height of these female academies before the integration of a schooling for boys and girls, this gives you a sense of what they were actually learning over the course of the day. And you can see that's a fairly well-established, if somewhat limited, education in terms of the subject material. And you see that geography and map drawing was pretty consistent, right? And what that did was, like I told you, draw on different elements of their curriculum. It was a way to learn drawing, a way to learn penmanship, a way to learn art, and of course, a way to learn geography. And what did these look like? I'm just going to show you a few. I know that they're very familiar to many of you, but they develop in sort of genres. And the one genre I'll show you here is very common, again, imported from England, and that is whether they were stitched or painted or drawn, they were double hemispheres quite often. And so you can see a young woman, a Quaker young woman, stitched hers here at right. At left, we have Julia Carpenter, who has a very elaborate way of demonstrating her mastery of botanica through watercolor. And you can see other types here. Sometimes they're quite small. Other times, like you can see, they're large enough to be preserved by the families on rollers or silk ribbons or frames. Part of the reason we're lucky enough to see these is that they were handed down as prized objects within families and then handed over to archives. And so it's no small thing that these artifacts survive at all. I want to zero in on one young woman, Caroline Chester. Caroline Chester was taking classes at Miss Pierce's Litchfield Female Academy in the summer of 1816. This is right at the conclusion of the War of 1812, when a wave of patriotism swept over the United States, and we see a little bit of a bump in the map subjects. That is to say, the maps that are really most commonly found in the mid-18 teens are maps of the United States of America, and there's no surprise there. Caroline Chester enrolled, and she thought she might develop a map to exemplify her mastery of geography. And this took her quite a long time. I'm going to zoom in for you here on some detail, because what's crucial is not just what she's creating, but how she's creating it. Take a good look at this map. Pay attention to the way that she's mimicked every aspect of a printed map. The neat line, the lines of longitude and latitude, and then also the cartouche. What she's doing is taking, this was quite common, one of the only available published maps during the War of 1812 was the Amos Doolittle, or what's called the Schulten and Kensett map of the United States. It was reprinted multiple times over the course of the war to reflect the different engagements in the Atlantic. And it was often used in the classroom as a subject for young women to copy. So when you see how similar they are, it's really quite astonishing. Caroline Chester is spending hours every day mimicking the printed dimension of the Doolittle map, down to the annotations, down to the look and feel of the coloration of the border, not to mention the details of hydrography and naming. In every respect, what Caroline Chester is doing is an exercise of mimesis. It is not map drawing so much as it is map copying. I'm lucky enough to have access to a part of Caroline Chester's journal, and I want to work through this quickly because it gives you a sense of what made Emma Willard so angry. Caroline Chester says in June, Mary showed us her large map of Asia, which she had just finished. And one of the United States both showed how much persevering industry joined with a large share of patience will accomplish. July, drawing on my map. Early August. The morning was devoted to drawing on my map, an employment of which I'm very fond. Mid-August, worked on my map. Late August, worked on my map. And here she is at the end of August. I once heard a gentleman remark that he had seen patience advertised for sale, and if I ever have the pleasure of seeing him again, I will petition him to purchase me a large quantity. I know no person who stands so much in need of patience as myself. September 7th, I am quite tired of drawing on my map. Now, I want you to think about the date here. This is the summer of 1816 in Litchfield, Connecticut. I'll draw your attention back to Catherine Cook, who at about the same time in Vermont is creating some kind of a similar exercise. And on the inside of her penmanship journal, I noticed this the other day. She writes, persevere, exactly what Caroline Chester was noting. What I want to draw your attention to here is how demanding, how arduous, how laborious these exercises in map drawing really were. And that's what makes the next few things I'm going to show you so important. As I mentioned at the outset, I was thrilled 10 years ago to discover Frances Henshaw's penmanship journal, one executed in 1823 at the Middlebury Female Academy. A few years ago, this came onto the market. Very, very tattered covers. But if we look here, I've enlarged it here, Eliza Henshaw. This is her penmanship journal from Miss Willard's school in 1816. What came up at auction a few years ago, and which is now at the Dobkin Collection in New York, is the penmanship journal of a woman named Eliza Henshaw. Eliza Henshaw was Frances Henshaw's older sister. Eliza Henshaw was one of the first students at the Middlebury Female Seminary. The Middlebury Female Seminary, not to be confused with the Academy, is the school that Emma Willard opens when she moves to Middlebury in the 18-teens. She had been a very promising student at these schools that I had described to you in the Connecticut River Valley. And by the time she is 17, she is both a student at these schools, but she is also teaching on her own. Her experience and her prowess lead to an invitation in 1807 from 3 different schools, one in Massachusetts, one in Connecticut, and one in Vermont. Ultimately, she ends up at Vermont in 1807, briefly working at this school, the Middlebury Female Academy. Then marriage intervenes, and she has a son. But in 1814, she opens up her own school, the Middlebury Female Seminary, at the age of about 23. And what I want to show you is what she's teaching Eliza Henshaw and how that differs from what had been so dominant in schoolgirl education at the time. You can see that Eliza Henshaw is being taught to replicate information. This is just taken from a textbook, like many of the others. But then after the text, the journal is turned over to maps, just like Frances Henshaw's would be, Harriet Baker's, and the others. But the maps in Emma Willard's school look different. And here I'll zoom in for you, but here's just a few pages. The text is at right, but look at the way she's teaching her young prodigy, Eliza Henshaw, to draw maps. What really matters to Willard is that students first and foremost draw from memory. Maps formed a crucial part of Emma Willard's students' education, but every day what she was having them draw was maps on their own. This one doesn't reflect it, but there's another one. Let me see. Sorry, I may have not have brought it in, but it reflects the lines of latitude and longitude, which Willard had students use. Here you see the notations, to actually guide their drawing of the maps, not as a copying mechanism, but as something that actually demonstrated their ability to understand the concept behind a map. Emma Willard's experience in Middlebury was crucial. She runs the school, the Middlebury Female Seminary, from 1814 to 1819. And the crucial moment here is her daily experience waking up, teaching her students in her living room, and then looking outside where the newly opened Middlebury College, with its vast acreage and its lavish buildings and its seemingly infinite resources, reminded her every single day of the disparity between female and male education. She remembered this for the rest of her life as one of the bitterest experiences, her inability to even sit in on courses at Middlebury. She remembered with pride that the tutors and the faculty at Middlebury would come to help judge her students in their geography lessons and invariably find them as skilled, if not more skilled, than the young men who had enrolled at Middlebury College. I want to drive that home to you because I believe that her experience in Middlebury, running that school and being reminded on a daily basis of the inequities in male and female education, governed the rest of her life as much as her graphic sensibility did. So much so that, to make a long story short, she develops from the summer of 1816 to the summer of 1818 a plan to reform female education. And with the help of a supportive husband, she has copies printed, and she petitions the head of Middlebury College, as well as the governor of Vermont, to support her in opening a landmark school for female education. Both the president of Middlebury College and the governor turned her down. She had asked in Burlington to use some unused buildings and to have a kind of pilot program, but there's no support forthcoming from the community at Middlebury, which she found exceedingly hidebound, but also from the state leadership. And so in 1819, she packs up and she leaves Vermont. And she moved next door to New York, where after some difficulty, she would ultimately, as many of you know, secure funding for the Troy Female Seminary, which was founded on her new understandings of what women were capable of. And those principles, that's a different story, but what we need to know for our purposes here is that essentially what Emma Willard wanted to do was to vastly expand the curriculum that women had access to. And I want to be careful here not to overstep. She thoroughly believed that her education would help women become better mothers and to, if you will, stay in their lane. But she also found no reason why women shouldn't have access to philosophy, to the hard sciences as we might understand them, to advanced mathematics, especially geometry. And that's the governing principle that directed the rest of her career. As soon as she's opened up her school in New York, she plunges headlong into publishing. And that's what I'm going to focus on for the rest of our time today. Her very first foray into school publishing is an ancient geography text, one of 2 volumes together on geography in the modern and the ancient world. She had hoped to be given the modern assignment, but that went to a more senior and experienced publisher. Textbook writer. And so she takes what she can get and she throws herself into ancient geography. But I want to show you how extraordinary her mind is. After having been exposed to so much graphic learning as a student herself, and after having taught for over 10 years and using maps on a daily basis to understand history, I want you to look at what she's done here. Facing the title page of her ancient geography is Progress of the Roman Empire, what at first looks like a fairly standard hydrographic or watershed map. But in fact, it's not a map in the true sense at all. It's a metaphorical map. It is a map to help students understand Roman history. Roman history is represented as the Amazon River. And so you can see, and she explains this later in her text, that the river, the main course of the river, is the Roman Empire as it brings in and subsumes all these other civilizations. The important point here is her ability to see graphics for their creative potential, her ability to think about a map as representing time as well as space. A few years later, and with the help of her former students, she publishes what might be her most enduring artifact. And that's a series of maps to accompany her history of the United States. These maps are often assumed to be supplemental to the textbook, her Republic of America, which remains in print until the 1860s, for over 40 years. But in fact, the maps predate the text. As she explains to us, the maps were the kind of thing she had been doing in the classroom for years. She believed the maps would actually stand on their own as a way to teach American history. And I'll show you a few of them. I want to begin with the most extraordinary one. And this really reminds us that Willard was very much a product of her society. The maps are numbered, but before she gets to the first map, she's going to show us this introductory map. If you see at the lower right, a map that looks at the locations and wanderings of the Aboriginal tribes. What she's done here is to use a map to collapse time. The map shows us centuries of migration of some of the largest tribes across what, I'll go back just a second, what would become the United States of America. You can see she's got faint lines here to remind you as a frame of reference of where the state boundaries, colonial before that, would eventually be drawn. But what's remarkable here is that she's using a map not to represent a moment in time, but as she called it, an entire epoch. It's also crucial that this is an introductory rather than a first map, because Willard understood Native Americans to really occupy a stage of history before civilization. And here she was wholly typical. She had the racial understandings that were very much a part of that culture. She sees Native Americans as, if you will, prehistory. That doesn't, I think, take away from what she's trying to do graphically, which is to show us change over time. And then in each subsequent map, she's showing us not just a moment, such as 1578 and the signing of the first Anglo patent in North America, but also what happens up to and pursuant to that. So we have 1578, which is a moment, by the way, that's important for Anglo-American history. But look to the right, and I'll zoom in even more for you. But what she's done is to identify the different nationalities and to give you coloration. There's a mistake here in the color, but you can see what she's trying to do is help students understand the imperial rivalry that dominated the 16th century. She's given us little clues here to think about the different eras, different moments of conquest, of colonization. I'll just show you one more to give you a flavor. Here we are, a second moment where she takes a critical year, in this case, 1620, and then shown you all the things that are sort of leading up to that. If you look at right, you've got the different ships in service to the different patrons, but also she's highly attuned to what will become the critical substructure of the southern colonies, which is slavery. and she identifies the arrival of the first Negroes, as she calls them, which would be sold into slavery in Virginia. The series of maps was a hit, and Willard ended up incorporating those maps into the textbook itself. But then there's a really interesting moment in the early 1830s where she writes and reflects that the problem with maps is that they just develop and reflect space and time in a kind of one-dimensional way. What she really wants is a map that can help young people understand the experience of time. And so the next few graphics that I'm going to show you are her attempt to convey to young people why and what history actually matters. The first of these enterprises is published in 1835, and it's a companion to her universal history, what you might call now a world history. And you can see it's designed to accompany her universal history. But I want to tell you that every time she issues a graphic or a series of maps, she intends that visual to stand on its own. In other words, the text is almost supplementary to the graphics. The graphics are never supplementary to the text. And she intends the graphics to be as complete as possible. And so what we have here is history rendered as a river. And some of you know that this is a very common trope in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries. At the top, we have the creation, and then we have the division from ancient to middle to modern, to try to give students a way of breaking down the vast eras of human history. We have the birth of Christ here at the right-hand side, and I'll zoom in so you can get a sense of what the graphic did and the multiple levels on which it worked. Here we have centuries, so absolute time, but also crucial moments. And then here in the middle, she's going to visualize the look and feel of civilizational history. So we have the height of the Roman Empire, but what do we have here? Something that really interested her, the Barbarian Invasions. And they're in darkness because she's trying to show them as, in terms of civilization, an era of darkness. And they're also very, very kind of complicated and intersecting for the way that they crossed and intermingled. You can see that she has made a judgment here about civilizations that are inferior and those that are more superior. And then as she goes even further, she'll show us that some of these are permeable, while others have sharp divisions between them, whereas there what she called little or no connection between them. So for instance, you can see that the colonies grow out of and are very close to Great Britain. There are lots of ways that this reflects the prejudices of her own mind, and her prejudices were considerable, not just against Native Americans, but also against Blacks. But they also give us a sense of how she was trying to convey enormous amounts of data to young men and young women. And for her, the principle was always to communicate, to memorize, and remember. Those are the things that for her demonstrated mastery. And for those reasons, she would be dismissed by later generations as being hopelessly part of what they called a rote system of education. But at the time, she was also trying to break away, not just from the female constrictions of her day, but also the intellectual ones, by showing something that would engage a young person's mind. From this perspective sketch, as she calls it, she then develops another layer still. Here's her Temple of Time, which was issued a few years later. And I'll zoom in so you can see her thinking. I find this to be one of the several graphics that is perhaps too clever by half. It's too complicated, but that doesn't really bother me because what we can see here is a graphic mind at work. Notice that the stream of time that I just showed you forms the floor work. And then she's paired that with another dimensionality here of time on the left, the centuries. And you can see when she makes this in the 1840s, we are midway through the 19th century, but also crucial leaders. And then at the top, the students would be given a blank template to fill in. Which are the most important statesmen, say, of the 17th century? Which are the most important theologians of our own day? So that students were constantly asked to integrate space and time and space, in a way that gave them, forgive me, but a larger architecture to work with. If you zoom in here, you can see her thinking. I want to be clear that this is not mimicked or pirated, and so we have to be careful about claiming too much importance for this. For me, the Temple of Time is crucial for what it tells us about Willard's thinking. And there you get a slightly closer view of the floor work that's now been colored to really identify what's similar and what's different. The last map I want to show you in some ways is the most simple, in other ways is the most profound. In 1853, after the conclusion of the US war against Mexico, the United States gained an enormous territory of land, immediately followed by the negotiations for the Northwest with Great Britain. Emma Willard was thrilled about this. She was above all a patriot, an ardent, even jingoistic patriot for her own country. And in 1853, she introduces this, in some ways, the graphic of which she is most proud. And I will say, the graphic that is most copied. You cannot open an American history textbook in the 20th century without finding some version of this map. And what she's done may look simple to us because we were all reared with this, but look at what she's done. The United States of America, historically and chronologically divided into 8 parts, with the original colonies, the additions, the Louisiana Purchase, and so on and so forth. She thrilled at this in part because Emma Willard understood and believed in manifest destiny, or the divine right of the United States to become a continental nation. And what she's done is to collapse what is an enormously violent history of dispossession, of war, of force, and to make it into a seamless and almost inevitable manifest nation. In other words, it is so obvious to us in part because she gave us a narrative in this map, one that told the story from a particular point of view, and one that narrated American history as seamless, if not destined. I'm going to close there and just give you one takeaway, and that is one of my favorite quotes of Willard is in a private moment. This is a woman of enormous confidence, if not ego. She wrote to one of her closest confidants in 1844, just after she had issued the Temple of Time, and said, rather boastfully, "In history, I have invented the map." Now, of course, that's not true. There's a long history of people using maps to tell time, of graphic innovations in mapping, and in graphic innovations of chronology. But what it does give us a sense of how Willard understood her own position in the 19th century and the contributions that she was making. And I want to remind you that that was both formed by her early education in those female schools, because that gave her a sensitivity of graphics, of art, of design, of perspective, but it also gave her something to rebel against. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was absolutely wonderful. We have a few questions that I will read aloud. And my reminder to those who are watching along in the Zoom, if you would like to add your questions in, you can use either the Q&A function or the chat. I'll start with the first question in the Q&A function here. Jody says, I understand that botany was taught to females. I'm curious if that education extended to any intersections of botany and geography, for example, today's biogeography, or was that broader scope of thought not considered appropriate?
That's a wonderful question, Jody, and that's something I've continued to think about. What I've learned from some scholars who look at these maps and the botanical cues in them is that a lot of it had to do with their ability to identify flowers as having meaning. So there are flowers that signify friendship or sorrow or death or nostalgia. But your question is a little deeper, and my understanding is that the botanic dimensions of female education really begin to explode in what's called natural philosophy. That was the phrase for natural science in the 19th century, by the mid-19th century forward. Prior to that, I would say that most of these run-of-the-mill female schools, if that's fair, were not teaching natural science in any deep way. That's one of the things that Willard was doing differently at Troy.
Thanks. A couple of questions from the chat. Did the girls at the school have sort of maps within their curriculum to help them when they made their maps? So anything broader that they were learning from?
That's one of my favorite things to think about, because because of cost considerations, there are very few printed, inexpensive atlases in the early 19th century. There are a few, but you couldn't have expected most of these schoolgirl female seminaries to have access to that. And in fact, that is one theory of why map drawing proliferated. In other words, they were drawing maps that then they would hold onto as reference materials. That was certainly Willard's idea. I'm going to have you draw these maps and you will keep them for a lifetime. As atlases, and Willard is one of the publishers, begin to be cheaper in the 1820s, interestingly, you see the decline of this practice. In other words, as students have more ready access to inexpensive atlases, they're less and less frequently drawing maps of their own. The final thing I'll say is that there's a wonderful collection of these at the Osher Map Library in Portland. And what I've learned from those curators is that when you actually have the physical object in front of you, you can see that many of these were being drawn by teachers as models for their students. And so constantly you have young women who were trained in this, who then become teachers and take the practice. So you'll find these kind of schoolgirl maps on the frontier of Mississippi, if some young woman had to have been trained in this kind of map drawing when she was a young girl in the Northeast.
Great, thanks. We had a question from the chat earlier. That's a question for the Vermont Historical Society. Does VHS have any of these early female maps and or penmanship books with maps? And I answered it in the chat, but I wanted to call it out here as well. We do have some spectacular schoolgirl maps in our collection, as well as samplers related to schools and to lines of thought. We had one of our schoolgirl maps on exhibit last year. So we do have that examples. I did a very, and I emphasize this is cursory, a very cursory look into our library catalog, and we do have penmanship books, but they all appeal to be related to young men, not young women. So they might provide a contrast.
Yes, and Amanda, that's a really good point, because penmanship was a crucial practical skill. If women were going to go into anything related to the family business or bookkeeping or teaching, penmanship was, for men and women, fundamental. Amanda, can I follow up? Are any of those available digitally or only in the archive?
Yes and no. Some of them are available digitally. Some of them are only available in the archive. It's a work in progress, but we will certainly get you connected with them. And anyone else who's interested in looking and thinking more about the maps in the Vermont Historical Society collection. Our research library is right now open by appointment, and of course you can always reach out virtually as well, and we'll work with you on finding that. So there's definitely more work. I know we recently actually did catalog all of our samplers. So those I mentioned in the lead up to this that our museum catalog is slowly becoming available online, so the samplers should be up there soon. if they are not already, so because those were recently done as part of a research project. Following up, continuing questions from the chat. One question is, so memory and the concept of a map was then more important than geographical accuracy in these maps that are being produced?
I think it depends on who the teacher is. So what I've noticed is that the highly precise, well-executed ones that Willard is frustrated by, as what she calls mimesis, those are the ones that are really testing not even memory, they're testing patience and artistic skills. You are quite correct that Willard prioritizes memorization. But within that, geographical relationships are really crucial to her. In fact, one of her innovations that she's most proud of in her publishing in the 1820s, she says, I am one of the first people to help students think about geography comparatively. And she says, I've been doing this since I was a teacher in Vermont in 1816. She's constantly calling back to her time in her first school in Middlebury, that was the place when she finally had the freedom to experiment. And some of her curriculum is quite traditional. She maintains needlework, for instance, because I think she knows that she has to convince those Middlebury families to send their kids to study with her. So her curriculum does look somewhat like the traditional curriculum, but within that, she has big plans for how to cultivate memory, but to also help students think about geography in terms of relationships.
Another question, did Willard include only her own maps into her books, or did she include any of her students' maps?
Well, it's funny, she hires her former students. So Eliza Henshaw ends up helping her. Harriet Bowers Mumford, one of her first students at Troy, ends up making the maps in her ancient atlas of 1827 before they go to the engraver. So it's kind of interesting. She could have had professional engravers. She was in Hartford and around there. She could have called on anyone, but she kind of knows who she wants to hire. And quite often she hires students that have been trained by her to draw these maps. Now, those are very much traditional maps in some way in her ancient atlas. So I don't want to claim that they're revolutionary, but I do think it's interesting that she's forever hiring and leaning on her former students and bringing them back to Troy to teach.
I kind of love that she's creating her own, female knowledge networks in a way.
Yes, it's a reliable, it's a known quantity, right? If she taught the student.
Yeah, sure. Robbie asks or observes, it looks like she was an early proponent of cross-disciplinary or humanities education by, he's referring specifically to the temple graphic that you showed with different categories of eminent people across the roof there.
Yes, it is. I do want to be clear that we might, subsequent generations very much dismissed her as a kind of traditional educator. If you looked at that graphic, it's very much great men of history and a few great women. But so yes, cross-disciplinary and very much about leaders in the arts. She herself is enamored of art and this is interesting to me. She's incredibly frustrated as a young girl that she can't understand perspective in drawing because she was never given access to geometry. It makes her enraged. So she teaches herself geometry. But her point is, how can we expect young women to think about dimensionality in space if we're not even giving them the tools to understand perspective? But so that's just to say she's an appreciator of all dimensions of the humanities. She teaches Locke and Paley to her young female students, which I think is remarkable when she's in Vermont. But it's very much a 19th century version of the humanities.
Thanks. Emily observes that Willard's maps were basically propaganda.
Well, all maps are propaganda. Let's just be honest about that. Every map is a choice. And so the term is useful to a degree, but it also fails to understand that every map is a decision about what to leave out and what to put in. Having said that, I do think her maps are what I would call extraordinarily Western in the way that we would later call or characterize something as a function of Western civilization. She's deeply, deeply engaged in the American expansionist project. She thrills at the thought of Native Americans being swept away, whether it's by disease or by force. I want to be very, very clear about that. I've written pretty extensively on her understanding of Native Americans. And I saw that there's another question related to that. Yes, she wholly regrets that America inherited slavery by the time of its independence. She is devastated by the growing sectional crisis of the 1850s, and she devotes the last part of her life to trying to avert civil war. But I want to be honest also that her method of averting civil war is compromise. And while she supports Lincoln, she's deeply concerned about what it might mean to liberate 4 million slaves. So her racism is very deep-seated and also quite typical.
Thank you. Bonnie would like to know how widely Willard's texts and maps were adopted in Vermont schools, if you know that.
Oh, that's a great question. I can't speak to Vermont. That would be something I could try to do my homework on. She is, the height of her sales, which I would say is the 1830s, 40s, 50s, she's second only to Peter Parley, a name you might also know. Another one that's way up there is Jessie Olney in terms of history and geography textbooks. So she's doing just fine. Republic of America goes through, I think, 15 or 20 editions. Her ancient geography goes through multiple editions. She's not at the very, very top, but she's pretty close. I can't speak, however, to how extensively the Vermont schools adopted it. Those are, that's really hard to tell because the records aren't there in the way that they would be by the turn of the 20th century. So you kind of have to be creative. And when you think about where things were adopted, you can look at advertisements, you can look at sales or publication records. Some of her publishers kept records. You can look at their correspondence. I've got a lot of letters between her and her publishers saying, hey, can you hurry up with this revision? We really need to get this out for the fall semester because such and such has decided they'll take your textbook. So a lot of it you can see in the papers more than in published sources.
Carmen says the Emma Willard School still exists in Troy. Do you have a sense of how the school evolved after Willard left?
A little bit. I'm in touch with them here and there. I've always wanted to visit. That was a plan for this year. It didn't happen. It's a very well regarded, I think today it's just called Emma Willard, or that's the name it goes by. But my understanding, it's a very, very well regarded secondary school for girls. Emma Willard begins to seed influence and control by the 1850s and 60s and give others more room to shape it. What is indisputable is the reach and the influence she has in terms of training so many teachers in the early 19th century.
A question from the Q&A. Sarah asks if you know when Middlebury College in the state of Vermont began to see the light and to encourage and support female higher education.
Someone can quickly look that up. I don't know when Middlebury goes co-ed, but I think it's after World War II.
I think it's 1873.
Okay, thank you. So it's not like Dartmouth, right?
No, it's earlier than other schools, but it's by no means early. Mm-hmm. And it is a split school until around World War II. So that
so it has two separate tracks. Right.
Yeah, a little bit like the Harvard and Radcliffe model.
Yep.
Maybelle Chellis is the first Middlebury woman graduate, and I believe she's class of 1873. Although someone in the chat can certainly shout out if I feel like it's something I should know. But yeah.
Yeah, that experience with Middlebury College was really formative to her. To see the resources those men had access to and to see how well her students were doing with nothing, not even heat. That made a pretty firm imprint. She remembered that well into her advanced years and constantly wrote about it.
Diane would like to know if you have a sense of how Willard's early use of graphics was received by other educators.
Yes, and this is something that's so fascinating to me. All signs point to an increasingly competitive publishing market And I think that's part of what's going on is Willard and her collaborators are constantly saying, nothing on the market is good, right? This is what's going to distinguish us. And in fact, I think her graphics are a way of distinguishing her work. In other words, there's a strategy there. But into the 20s and 30s, she's constantly engaged with attacks that other people are pirating her work, other people attacking her for being unoriginal or derivative. To me, the veracity of these attacks is less interesting than the fact that they're happening. In other words, they show us something about more and more kids are going to school outside the home, more and more teachers are adopting published textbooks, and the market is beginning to matter much more. And so that's really fascinating to me. And I think if we're going to understand Willard's leaning into graphics, we have to understand that she wants to make a mark on the industry. So she's an entrepreneur here, and she's always quite suspicious of others taking advantage of her work.
We have just a couple of comments in the chat that I want to read out for people in case I missed them. Willard's Geography was advertised in the Vermont Chronicle at one point, so it looks like Bonnie is commenting that we do have some evidence for its use in Vermont schools. Melissa says that the Edward Willard staff is listening in. Hello to anyone who... and Emma Willard, thank you for joining us today. And a couple of Emma Willard alums as well in the chat. So thank you.
Well, I would, yeah, and if any of you have ideas or advice or things that this is prompting in your own mind and want to share them, I welcome that, because I've been studying Willard for years, but I continue to find more and more dimensionality when I look at her early life in these arenas. Yeah.
I believe we have reached the end of our questions. I'm just going to give one last call out for anyone. If you can type quickly and get in one last question before we wrap up today, I will extend my thank you and my sign off a little bit to give you time to type quickly if you'd like to ask one last question. But thank you so much for everyone for joining us today. Thank you to Susan for an absolutely wonderful presentation. People are commenting, thanks so much for a wonderful presentation in the chat as well. You have been with the Vermont Historical Society today. Remember to check out vermonthistory.org for more programming, more resources. I mentioned the museum and library catalogs today, as well as other recorded programs. This program has been recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel after today. And it sounds like Susan and I are going to have some correspondence about VHS's materials, so perhaps we will welcome her back in the future to continue this wonderful research.
Thank you, Amanda, and thank you all so much for your comments and your patience. I appreciate it, especially in our new virtual world. It means a lot.
Well, thank you so much, everyone. Have a wonderful day and enjoy the day.